Hey, how you doing? It's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net and welcome to today's video. In this demonstration, we're going to be drawing up a fairly old piece of comic book art that I worked on a few years ago now, called Boarork the Brute. And this was an original character that I came up with, and I thought that it'd be really fun to take a step back in time and just take a look at how I used to approach the comic book illustration process. Because over time, over the years, things have changed, and I've switched up my approach and tried out different things, kept what worked, threw out what didn't work so well, and come up with a fairly solid approach to my process now that works fairly well and gives me the result that I'm striving for most of the time. But it wasn't always like that, and you'll notice here just how much a significant transformation my style has gone through as you see how I used to actually illustrate my characters, the kind of approach I took to rendering and placing in shadows. And what I'd like to do here in this video is just make a few comparisons between how I work now and how I used to work, because the first thing that you're going to notice here is that the overall establishment of those foundations has been something that I've kept all the way through. None of that has changed. I still start out, as you can see, with a very basic figure that over the top has the anatomy of the characters loosely sketched in. And this is something that is always going to be there for me, no matter how much I evolve and grow as an artist, because it is a fundamental drawing principle that's always going to be used to lay out the composition of my illustrations and to make sure the characters are sized up, placed on the page, and posed accurately before I start to invest the amount of time that it's going to take to see this illustration through to completion. Because although this looks very, very simple and very, very basic, I know I get it, admittingly it is, and it doesn't look very flash whatsoever, but here at this point in the overall process is the most important to get right. We need to make sure that these characters, these overall figures, are ship-shape before we start to commit to them and begin drawing in the rest of the design, which is what I'm doing now. And as you can see, I'm just working over the top of what's already there. I'm zoomed out as well, you'll notice that. And the reason that I am zoomed out from such a far distance is because I want to make sure that from a distance the illustration is going to read. This is the number one way in which I'm able to get a good look at the overall composition and to make sure that that is coming together in a way which is aesthetically pleasing, which reads accurately, which tells a story that I'm trying to convey within the illustration in a clear and concise, understandable manner that the audience is going to understand. Because every illustration that you set out to do really is just your way of telling a story. You're just telling it in a visual narrative, in a visual manner. And so there's a message here, and the clearer we can get that message to come through, the better. And the way in which that story is told is, of course, through the characters, the actors, if you will, that are present within our illustration. And so that's how you can very much think of them as you maneuver these characters into a variety of different poses, trying to get a good fit for each. That's how you want to be thinking, is how can I place and pose and position these characters in a way that tells the story that I want to tell. And here, as you can see, Boarork the Brute, he's a barbarian of sorts and not one that you want to mess with. He'd certainly give Conan a run for his money. At least that's what I like to think. And basically, the story that I'm trying to tell here with this particular character is that he's just decapitated with his giant sword 3 orcs, or monsters, fantasy monsters of some kind. You know, I'm going to say that they're orcs because they kind of look like orcs. And the problem with this particular composition is, though, and there are a few issues with it, and primarily they are that the orcs are all facing toward Boarork the Brute, but ultimately when I start to draw in the faces that are going to be present on their heads, their decapitated heads that he's holding up in a very powerful pose, you'll notice that they're facing toward us. So really, for this story to make sense, we have to accept the fact that somehow the heads are spun around to look at us, even though the orcs weren't initially facing that direction in the first place. So that's a first issue. And then, of course, we also have his back leg there, which is supposed to be, coming up from behind the rock. And that doesn't quite look right. It didn't quite turn out the way that I wanted it to in the end. And it was a fundamental flaw that was overlooked in the initial drafting stage of the illustration, and one that I regret because, later on when I put this out there, a lot of people, as often happens, liked to point out the mistakes that I had made. And, I love when people point out those mistakes because if I'm open enough, and it's even hard for me to be that open sometimes, if I am open enough though, and I take to heart that critique, that feedback, the useful critique anyway, it makes me a much better artist. And I wouldn't be where I'm at now within my artistic development if it wasn't for those people. And I owe them the world. Those other artists, even the people who weren't artists, who took the time to give me feedback, to lend me their thoughts and tell me what they think I could do to improve upon what I'd already done. Because heck, I can't do that myself. I'm only one dude with one perspective, and I can only see so much in my own artwork. I'm very, very connected to it, close to it, just like you are to your artwork. And so for me to be able to tell where all the errors and mistakes are present within my illustrations is near impossible. I need that fresh perspective from other people, and when I'm able to put it out there and show it to others, that's what I'm looking for, because all the compliments I get, that makes me feel good, of course, and that gives me momentum. It gives me drive to push onward and to keep on doing what I'm doing. But it really isn't as informative as a good, solid critique, because that I can do something with. I can put it into action and I can improve my artwork as a result, which is, the best thing in the world. That's the greatest investment that you could make in your craft, is to take on board feedback, put it into action, and do the best you can to improve upon what you've already got handled for the most part. Okay, so you can see here I'm just building up this illustration in layers. So what I had done in the previous step is I drew an anatomy sketch over those basic mannequin model poses that I had for the characters. And now on top of that anatomy sketch, I'm drafting in the design. So I'm drafting in the design for the orcs, for Boarork the Brute, and he is a very brutish barbarian. And, Boarork, the name, it has the word boar in it. So his belt, which I'm going to be placing around his torso there, I'm going to try to make it look like a wild boar with tusks. So, these little trinkets, Easter eggs, if you will, that I incorporate into my design, it all lends to the story that I'm trying to tell. And as I said, in an illustration like this, narrative should be at the forefront of importance. It should be at the top of the list of priorities when it comes to, figuring out what it is you're really trying to show people within your illustrations. So you can see here that I'm attending to the orcs. I'm sketching in a rough design for them, seeing whether or not I can come up with something which is compelling. And then I'm knocking out a very simple, very loosely sketched in background, just to give the illustration a sense of place. Again, I've said this in previous videos, when you can cultivate a compelling background for your illustrations, it makes the experience that the audience has that much more immersive, and it also makes the characters seem more believable, because now you're not just presenting them in this white void. All of a sudden there's this world that they're a part of, that you've got them presented in. It gives them context, and with that context you can also draw the viewer in and suspend their disbelief and make them really feel as though they're a part of that narrative that you're trying to create within your illustration. So we've got the overall draft done and dusted. So now what I've done is I've created a new layer And this is going to be for the outline of the character. And you'll notice that as I lay it in here, I'm applying line weights as I go. Now, what are line weights? You might have heard me explain it before, but I'll do a quick recap on it just in case you haven't. What line weights do is add a certain amount of dynamic aesthetic that creates a much more desirable and appealing look for your line. And all it is just variation within the thickness of the lines that you're laying down. So you're going from thick to thin in certain areas to either convey light direction within the scene, to get certain elements within the illustration to stand out more than others, to draw attention to them, or to create the illusion of depth and distance between one element to the next. And the way in which that works is, in general, when it comes to the different things that you can convey with line weights, the thicker the outline is, the more attention it's going to pull toward it. So, for example, if you've got 3 balls lined up in a row and you give one of them a thicker outline than the other, well, that ball is going to draw attention to it first because it's got a thicker outline. It's standing out more. It has more contrast to it. And so the same deal with depth as well. Anything with a thicker outline is going to appear closer. So when it comes to foreshortening, for example, and you're trying to pull that off in a convincing way, well, make sure that the way in which you're outlining it, especially when it comes to line weights, is that the form, as it comes toward the viewer, the outline around it is going to increase in terms of thickness and heaviness. So the intensity, the level of intensity of the line. And that's how I use line weights. And of course, when it comes to indicating light direction, well, in that case, what you're going to find is that any of the contours that lie on the dark side of the form that's facing away from the light will typically be thicker than those which are directly being hit by the light on the light side of the form. So, in general, you can think of it as kind of like I like to think of the lines that I lay into an illustration as almost like a value study, right? Like any portion of the form that I'm working on that is being hit by direct light is going to have a very minimal amount of detail and very, very lightly defined line work. Whereas on the dark side of those forms, the detail is going to slowly increase to darken up the overall tone as the form transitions over into a darker value. And then you're also going to see the line weight surrounding that form become thicker and thicker. So, hopefully that makes sense. That is line weights in a nutshell. And I know that the moment I learned them, it made a significant impact on the quality of my comic book art overall. And I initially learned line weights, in fact, from David Finch. I bought his course on the Gnomon Workshop, and it's a course that I suggest on a regular basis to check out if you're new to comic book art, because it really does it opens your eyes to, how a pro approaches the comic book illustration process. And, I know that you're probably learning a little bit here on the How to Draw Comics channel, but still, I mean, the more teachers that you can learn from, the better, because everybody has a different approach, a preference to the way in which they work. Maybe you think that someone's artwork looks great, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their process and the way in which they approach it is going to resonate with you. So you have to figure out what works best for you and go with that. Develop it from there. Refine it in your own way. What you'll see here in this particular demonstration as I pencil out the refined line work of Boarork the Brute here and his orc victims, the poor orcs that have come up against him, unfortunately, you'll notice that the style that I've gone for, and not intentionally, by the way, but just the style that I used to have, is much more graphic compared to what I do now. These days I go for a rougher feel, one that has a hint more realism injected into it in one way or another. And it's because I don't necessarily rely on thick shadows like you can see me outlining here around Boarork's torso. And I also use a lot more rendering to capture a wider variety of tones, a wider width of tonal range, you could say. So now, instead of just having black and white, like you can see here with the light areas and the dark areas defined by the shadows and the lighter areas of the form, instead of just that black and white tone and then maybe some rendering in between to blend it, now almost all of my character has some level of tone applied to it, depending on what I'm working on. You know, some characters are just going to require way more rendering than others. The difference can be seen mostly when it comes to female and male characters. Female characters just tend to have less detail incorporated into them, whereas male characters, or monsters and creatures especially, they will typically have way more rendering involved in order to capture the more defined anatomy and, of course, the grisly details on those creatures that I mentioned before. So you'll see that a lot here with the orcs as well as Boarork the Brute. But, you know, the approach that I take now is much less mathematical and analytical. Now I kind of go with the flow. I let myself sink into the creative process, and I really do feel that I'm much more creative now in the way that I work. But what I loved about David Finch's approach, which again, you'll notice the rendering style that I go for here, the way in which I'm incorporating these line weights is very similar to the art of David Finch, and you'll see those similarities for sure if you're a Finch fan. But the reason that I loved his approach is because it was mathematical. It was easy to replicate for another artist, and so it's something that I tried my best to emulate as closely as possible, and I was successful at it. You know, there did come a point where, hey, I learned how to place in the shadows in a way that made the forms read impactfully, clearly, and helped to overall make the image much more digestible. But, and you know, I rendered it out, and the rendering looked great. But after a while, I think, and this was something that I was talking to my good buddy Death about on one of our latest podcast episodes, it does get to a point within your comic art process where you kind of, you know, you're getting through those levels, right? Again, think of it as a video game. You're getting through the levels, you're conquering the bosses, and you're getting better and better through practice. As you level up your skill set, you gain those experience points, you begin to progress throughout the game of comic book illustration all the way through to mastery, and eventually you get into these higher levels where, you know, it's almost like the game is too easy. And I know that can sound, you know, kind of egotistical to say, like, oh, you know, comic book art is too easy for me now. But it's not necessarily that. It's just certain aspects of it become less of a problem than they once were. And what you find is that because they're less of a problem, you've got your brain doesn't have as much novel considerations to make. It doesn't have to think about it anymore. So it's just going through the motions as you work. And you'll often find that if you don't have the time to sit down and really work on developing and evolving your craft, you know, say for example, you're working in a studio or you're just doing commission work for clients, and you don't have that time to just study and self-reflect on the direction that your style is headed in, you will find it becomes somewhat monotonous. You know, there's just nothing new there. It's the same each and every time. You don't get to be that creative with the way in which you work anymore. And I think that for me, that's why over time, my style has just naturally progressed. And it's not by any intention of my own. I think I just get bored with what I'm doing, and so I find new ways to intentionally challenge myself. Now, I know that sounds crazy. It sounds absolutely, you know, mind-boggling to think that, you know, you get to such a point within your own artistic development that you start to find things that cause you to stress out, the things that you have to, you know, accomplish even at those higher levels. But it is something that I've found I have to constantly do to keep myself sharp, to make sure that I don't lose the buzz that I've always had for comic book illustration, because whatever it is that you set out to do, you're going to get bored of it once you master it. That's just the reality of it. Once our brain gets to know something enough and that novelty disappears, it wants something more to latch onto, and that's just its natural tendency to be hungry for new knowledge. Our brains are wired that way. Once we learn something, we get bored of it. We want something new. We want to be challenged. That's why games are so fun. That's why crosswords are so fun. And why it's so boring to play a video game on God mode every time, because you want that challenge there, and you don't want to replay levels of the same video game, because unless there's something to be gained from it, and maybe there is, maybe there's additional little things you can unlock within the video game by going back through those levels, and sometimes that is the same for art. I'm not gonna lie, every now and then I do need to revisit anatomy or proportions just to make sure that I'm on track with that, because it's easy to let things slide. But again, eventually those things, they fall back into the background and they're not so bothersome anymore. You become confident with it, and you get to know the way in which you work. And this is why it's important to be sure your artwork doesn't become a task, a chore. Because the moment that it becomes a chore, that it feels like a job, and you'd rather be doing anything else but that, that's when it becomes a problem. Because then you procrastinate. Then you put it off, and you find anything else to do but that. And that's not how you want to feel about your artwork, surely. I know that's certainly the case for me. I want to wake up excited to tackle that next illustration. I want to be pumped up to work on that next character that I want to draw, or, whatever it is, even if it's just something that I'm about to learn. I love the challenge of learning. If something is bugging me, or something's not quite right about an illustration that I'm working on, and this is definitely the case a lot of the time, I'll leave an illustration just being totally bugged by something that's not working out within it, and I'll go away and I'll think about it. And I love thinking about it. I love that process, just going over it in my mind again and again, finding solutions for the problems that I'm facing. And it's the reason that I love drawing in the first place, because it does present me with that level of mental stimulation I need to remain hooked. If I didn't have that, I honestly don't think that I'd still be here drawing. And I find that that's something that I'm always constantly trying to do, especially these days, now that I have been drawing for a while and I've sorted out most of the shortcomings that I used to experience when it came to my art, as any beginner will. Now it's a case of, okay, well, how do I keep myself motivated? Because sometimes there are days where I don't feel like drawing. Like I'm not in the mood to draw. It's not something that is making me excited, and I don't want that to become a habit. I don't want there to be more days where I'm unmotivated to draw than days where I'm totally buzzed and excited to get to the drawing board and work on something. That'd be a tragedy for me. So I'm always looking for that next thing to conquer, and hopefully you are too. It's a weird balance, because the whole time that we're trying to get better and better at this craft, we're also trying to avoid that point where we get so good we become bored. So it's this weird oxymoron in a way where, you can't win either way. If you do get to the point where you eventually reach the end of the road and you realize all your potential as a comic book artist, that's the point at which you stop improving. That's the point at which, there's nothing left to do. You've really mastered it. You've accomplished all that you set out to complete. But what next? So I know for me that the big deal I'm about to face, especially next year when I jump onto my actual comic book, I've got a bit of a plot written up and I'm looking forward to it. the big deal I'm going to be facing is sequential storytelling. That's very different from illustration like you're seeing me do up here. In this single frame of illustration, I can compose a story. And some would argue that, hey, that's even more difficult, composing an entire narrative within a single frame. However, sequential storytelling, you've got to have the narrative flow in a seamless way that makes logical sense, that the audience understands. It's not just the idea you're getting across now, it's the flow of that sequential idea, because it's not just one single frame anymore, it's multiple frames that are getting across a narrative. And so to get that to work, I can only imagine the considerations that I'm going to have to make when I progress, when I graduate to that new form of art, essentially, because it is a new form of art that I'll be getting into. I've done a little bit of sequential storytelling, and I like to think that I've got a bit of a knack for it, but that's the big trap, isn't it? Thinking that you have it under control, only to jump into it and realize, damn, I really know nothing. And I'm looking forward to it, in all honesty. I want there to be something within my art to constantly keep me on my toes, and I think that that's going to be a big area where I've got lots of room to grow. So always be looking for areas to grow within your art. And if you find that you're becoming disconnected and you're not really enjoying it anymore, there's just nothing there to keep you hooked, make sure that you're looking for areas in which you can improve. How can you step it up, make it that much better? Now, what you can see me doing here is I'm kind of sketching in where the shadows are going to be and then where the rendering is going to be. And what I'm going to do after that is I'm going to convert it to blue so that I can make a distinction between the final line art and this sketched up draft that I've got. There's layers and layers of draft at this point within the illustration. And then I'm going to go over the top of it again and place in that final line work. I guess I got, a little bit overly confident before, and I was jumping straight onto the final line work without having placed in these shadows, but it honestly was something that I needed to do. I had to go back and plan it out a little bit better just to make sure that when I was placing in those final crosshatches, they were all going to come together in a way that made those forms read. And I do jump the gun from time to time, and sometimes I pay for it, sometimes by some chance, luckily, it works out. But in order to give myself the best chance of success, I know that you got to put in that groundwork. You got to make sure that the draft checks out and that it's good to go before you do invest too much time into an illustration that might be going well in some ways, but ultimately doesn't come together as a whole in the way that you thought it would. You do have to, most of the time, work in a macro manner. In other words, you have to have a solid overall understanding of exactly how the illustration is going to play out before you start to get into the nitty-gritty details that are really going to pretty it up, the decorations on top, the cherry on top, I like to refer to it as, or think of it as if you prefer. Because that's all that these details really are. The comic book illustration process, it's not like the final artwork is something that you're going to be seeing in the beginning. No, in fact, you see something very, very different. You see a very basic, rudimentary version of it that you sit back and you just wonder, how am I going to take it from this very rough, very nasty, messy looking sketch all the way through to a completed, polished looking pro illustration? And, it takes time, honestly. If you don't have the ability to sit down and just dump hour upon hour upon hour into a complex illustration such as this, it depends on your style. Maybe you don't have a super complex style with loads of detail in it like I tend to do, but still, regardless, there is going to be a certain amount of time it takes you to get you from the draft all the way through to the final illustration, and you got to have the ability to sit there, to turn off the ADHD that we all seem to have these days, and to just really focus. And to do that, you have to build up your focus muscle. You need to be able to sit still for an elongated period of time without interruption and to knock out an illustration if you want to be productive with it. And I find that's very important, especially with something like this. If I dwell on it for too long, if it takes me a longer period of time to complete and I keep putting it off, and sometimes I'm in the mood to work on it, sometimes I'm not, and I'm kind of completing it bit by bit, I find that I do lose the energy, the inspiration, the motivation to keep on working on that particular artwork. And so I find that I have to just jump into it, complete it as fast as possible while I'm still feeling excited and the idea is fresh. And while it's still fresh, that's when I do my best work, because I know that it's just a matter of time before I start to lose interest, no matter how interested I was in it to begin with. And I think, going back to the sequential storytelling, working on an actual comic book, that's probably going to be one of the battles that I have yet to face. And I don't know if the full impact of that has hit me just yet, because when you think about it, you're working on a comic book over 30 pages, even just one comic book, right? And you're working on the same story, the same characters. How do you keep yourself interested? That's the question, because there needs to be something there, maybe the level of passion that you have for the story, how much it means to you, but there's got to be something there that keeps you hooked for that amount of time. And when you're working on a comic book, if say one illustration takes you a day to do, then a full comic book is going to take you at least 30 days, if not longer. So you got to remain invested for that amount of time. You got to remain excited about that project for a solid month at least in order to get a comic book done. So that's something that I'm bracing myself for, and hopefully it won't be a problem, but I have a feeling that it might be, just because, again, the moment that you start to invest into an idea is the moment you begin thinking about all the other cool ideas that you want to work on, because to realize an idea, it takes energy, it takes time. It's much easier to think of a cool idea than it is to execute on it. So, it's always something that I try to make sure I'm keeping balanced. I want to make sure that I'm keeping a balance between the ideas that I want to do and then actually making them happen. Because otherwise it can become a habit for you as an artist to always half do things. Start out with an idea, see it through until a certain point, the point at which you become disinterested in it or you want to do something else, and then just drop it. And it's half-baked. It's not ready to come out of the oven yet. And before you know it, you end up with a series of half-finished projects like this that just never see the light of day. And that isn't a good habit to get into, because it means that nothing ends up getting done. All of these ideas could very well be fantastic. They might be total gold. But if you only ever half see them through to the end, then you'll never really allow them to see their full potential. You'll never know what it could have been. And that's a shame, because what we're all about as comic book artists is seeing our ideas through to fruition and sharing them with the world. If we don't do that, then there's no point in doing what it is we're trying to do. So, I think at that point, your art and what it is you want to achieve with it requires a certain level of dedication, discipline, and commitment. You got to have a huge amount of commitment to the ideas that you set out to do, especially when it comes to comic books. Otherwise, just nothing will get done, as I was saying before. So here I'm going over the orcs, and I'm designing their outfit to a higher degree of clarity, just figuring out where the shadows are going to sit, and again, how the rendering is going to gradate from those solid blacks into the solid white highlights. And again, this is just as much a process as anything else. It does require a good, solid amount of time to actually get it to the point where you're ready to lay in the final line work following this particular process. Again, this is an old way in which I used to work. I don't work like this anymore. And in fact, I am confident enough comfortable enough to lay in the final line art with the basic sketch down. I don't necessarily need to depend on a draft which is articulated to this level of detail. But, the good thing is when you have got your illustration knocked out in the drafting stage to this level of refinement, it gives you very little guesswork later on down the track, and you're able to focus just on making sure that those lines are weighted just perfectly, making sure that the crosshatches you're laying in are also weighted well and that they are coming together to compose the gradients and the tones that you're after. Because when you've got a draft which is, this solid, you don't really have to think about, how the character is going to be posed, how the anatomy is going to be shaped. All you're doing is just refining what's already there on the page. And that at that point, it can become very easy, but then you start to sink into that rut of boredom that can often curse us and cause us to become very, very unmotivated to see the illustration through to completion. So at that point, what I tend to find I used to have to do is just keep a very clear, solid idea of the end destination that I'm headed toward in mind, and that's my compass. That's kind of what keeps me going in the direction that I'm headed in and gives me the strength to see it through. But and the more that I build up that end final outcome inside my mind, the more I find I'm motivated to see it through to completion, because I really do try to make it as awesome as I possibly can inside my head, because if that's what the end result of all this effort, of all this investment is going to be, then it's totally worth it. And you do have to mentally kind of manipulate yourself sometimes in that way to make sure you don't tap out too early on, to make sure that you see these things through to the end. So you can see that I'm being very, very rough here, and I'm just in Manga Studio, of course, using the darker pencil brush. I'm just going to take a sip of water here. I've been talking a fair bit throughout this demonstration, and we still got a little bit to go. All right, and we're back. I needed that. I get very excited when I'm sharing my process in these comic book illustrations, and I am glad that, you guys watching have been enjoying the videos, that you're getting a ton of value out of what you're seeing here. I've had heaps of fantastic, very encouraging comments that tell me just that, and, that's why I do these videos, in the hope that, like me when I was first coming up in the game, that you'll watch what I'm doing here on the screen, maybe try applying what it is you're seeing and see a significant improvement in your own work. One of the reasons as to why I'm inspired to create comic art tutorials in the first place is because the way in which I learned, and the big game changer for me as I was developing my own comic art skill set, was watching tutorials by David Finch. As I said before, Stephen Platt was another one whom I also found his course on the Gnome One workshop. They had a ton of great comic book illustration courses, and back in the day before, YouTube was really a thing. We had a very limited amount of resources when it came to learning this stuff, but I was very thankful that I found the tutelage that I did in order to get to the point that I'm at now, because I really do owe it to those guys. Like, without Stephen Platt and David Finch, and then, looking at the artwork and doing master studies of Marc Silvestri, Greg Capullo, and Jim Lee, all the artists whom, if you look at my style now, you can see them in my work. If it wasn't for them, there's no way that I'd be at the level of ability that I've somehow managed to develop for myself now. And I'm so thankful for that, because all I ever wanted to do was cool comic book illustrations. And to be able to do that now, it's something that I'm so thankful for. Like, I couldn't be happier when I'm able to sit down at the drawing board and actually be able to pull off the very artwork that inspired me to become good at comic books in the first place, comic book illustration. And hopefully it's the same for you, you know? I mean, whatever point at which you're starting out at, know that it's just a matter of time, dedication, and really putting in the hard yards to, and the repetition, making that mileage to get to the point that you want to be at. That's why I always say that talent is merely the motivation to pursue that which you're most passionate about. And as long as you can do that, as long as it means the world to you and that you couldn't live without it, it's almost a guarantee that you are going to realize your dreams, fulfill your goals as a comic book artist, and really truly be able to pull up the kind of illustrations that those who inspired you in the first place were able to do. And, you know, when you've got comic book artists who are total pros out there, like Jim Lee these days, who have YouTube videos out there showing you how to do what it is they do, I know it's easy to take for granted because we live in a time now where it's just that knowledge is so plentiful. It's every artist out there who are promoting themselves, like myself, you know, they've got videos and a YouTube channel out there that are teaching you exactly how it is they do what it is they do. And, you know, with that amount of information available to us so readily, it's easier to watch it all than it is to apply it. And, you know, the thing is, the missing ingredient to this video that you're watching now is something that I can't give you, which is to take what you're learning and then to put it into action. Because by putting it into action, that's when you really start to digest what it is you're learning, where you start to process it, assimilate it, and make it a part of the way in which you work. So, you know, I do get comments from people who surprisingly watch these crazy comic book illustration videos and tell me how they've drawn it out. They have actually done a master study watching these videos. And, you know, that excites me because that's exactly how I learned to get to where I am now. And I think that it's an amazing thing to be able to do, you know, to really conjure up the level of dedication needed to become a great artist, which, you know, I would say if there's a true thing that's going to hold you back, it is really just, you know, how much do you want this? You know, because if you want it and you truly want it, like comic book illustration is actually what you want to do, you think about it, you breathe it, you dream it, then 100% you're going to be able to get to the place that you want to be at with it. You're going to be able to eventually do what those you admire are able to pull off in their artwork and better. Because now, you know, my favorite artist is, and again, this kind of sounds egotistical, but my favorite artist is me. Like, I look at my own work now, and it resembles kind of a combination of Marc, Silvestri, Jim Lee, and David Finch, but it's very much taken on a life of its own. And I really am proud of what I'm able to pull off, you know, which is a very different feeling to what I used to have. I used to be absolutely embarrassed by the kind of artwork I was creating. I was very discouraged by the outcome a lot of the time. And if you're able to work through those moments of where you're shaken, your confidence is utterly shaken, where your ego is greatly humbled, and possibly when you're driven into the ground and you just do not want to draw any more. It's those moments where if you're able to get through them, you will grow the most. It's, as I always say, if you're a Dragon Ball Z fan like me, it's like being a Super Saiyan, right? Like with every battle, you become stronger and stronger. And you slowly but surely, your power level increases. It's the same with comic book art. The battles you face, and most importantly, the battles you lose but come through out on the other end, those are the ones that are going to make you a much stronger comic book artist. And never underestimate the power of that. Be thankful for the mistakes that you make along the way, because that's when you're going to learn. That's when you're going to realize your full potential as an artist. There really is no other way. As I said before at the beginning of this video, you don't learn through your accomplishments. Maybe you learn what you're doing right and you keep that, but really that's just that's not something that you even have to consciously think of. Your brain is naturally going to keep on doing what's working. That gets stored away almost automatically. But where you learn is when you face into the darkness, at your weaknesses, you look at your artwork and you look at the dark areas of your artwork, the dark side of it, the areas that you're not happy with, and you see the truth of what it actually is. You take off the rose-colored glasses. That's when you become less blind to the areas of improvement that you can explore. And it's hard to do sometimes, to be humble enough to say, hey, I'm not perfect. I'm not yet the comic book artist that I dream of being, and I've got a long way to go before I am. But when you can get to that point, and you can be humble enough to, again, look at your artwork in all its, when it's laid out to bare, when all the flaws are there and present and you're able to see them, that's when you're going to be able to address them. And once you address them, hey, you've leveled up. That's how you progress, how you develop yourself as an artist, how you become better and better. So I'm sketching in a leg for this orc here. Actually, I've sketched in a leg for both these orcs. I'm trying to give some level of movement to them. So again, this goes back to the whole narrative. I want to tell the viewer, these orcs have been marching up to face Boarork the Brute. They thought that they were going to stand a chance for some reason, but he lopped off their heads and decapitated them and is holding them up in a very victorious manner. Now, I actually thought that this composition was pretty, solid, but I later found out when I put this illustration onto the net, as I said before, that, it didn't really jive that well with people. They saw a few issues with it, and I think, honestly, I did become pretty discouraged from that, and that can be a trap that we all fall into from time to time, is when we do get negative feedback on our artwork, it kind of makes us question whether or not it's worth pursuing, whether or not we're supposed to be pursuing it. We're just not good. Why? Maybe, it's almost like we need to have or feel like we have this God-given talent, like we're supposed to be the artists that we're ultimately going to be someday, to be invested enough to keep on going with it. But that just about wraps it up for this demonstration. I hope that you've enjoyed it, that you've got a ton of value out of it. We will continue on with this video series. There is a lot to go here for Boarork the Brute. I think all up, this entire demonstration is about 3 hours long. So you're going to see that progress throughout the entire illustration. And yeah, well, actually, you know what? Let's carry on this video through to the end here. I didn't realize I was going to completely erase his leg and redo it. So as you can see, I make plenty of mistakes. I make my fair share of hiccups along the way. And in the back of my mind, I know that it's always worth revisiting them and rejigging the illustration or the portion of the illustration that needs to be reworked until it looks good to me. Because, unfortunately, if I don't do that, I later regret it big time after all is said and done, after the inks are done and the colors are completed. And I think to myself, if I had have gone back and I would have addressed the illustration earlier on and the flaws within it, I could have turned out real differently. But that just about wraps up today's demonstration. I hope that you got a ton of value out of it, that you enjoyed it, and I can't wait to show you what's in store for the following videos that I'm going to be uploading in this series. If you'd like more comic art tips, tricks, and tutorials, be sure to visit www.howtodrawcomics.net. Over on the site, you'll find a bunch of written tutorials by the talented Joe Catapano and myself. You'll also find the videos here on the YouTube channel. And when you're ready to delve deeper into the art of comic book illustration, be sure to check out our selection of courses. We've got a few there by Robert Marzullo, Ed Foychuk, and again myself, covering all sorts of topics to do with character design, anatomy, proportions, perspective, and pretty much anything else you can think of. So again, check them out, see if there's anything there that tickles your fancy, and I'll see you over again on howtodrawcomics.net. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, keep on creating, keep on practicing, and I'll see you in the next video.